Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is Chapter 19 of the American Pageant, titled Drifting Towards Disunion. If you know the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. Uncle Tom's Cabin, abolitionist novel about slavery. It had immense outreach across the country and in foreign spaces. It awoke people to the evils of slavery. It had a profound effect on politics and is also credited to have started the Civil War. Uncle Tom's Cabin was absolutely critical to revealing the moral issues with slavery beyond the technical, political issues about it, and it really awoke a lot of people who weren't interested in politics to now identify themselves with the abolitionist movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her novel was extremely popular, and her meeting with Abraham Lincoln showed how she had become a symbol for abolitionism and the Northern cause. So as Harriet Beecher Stowe became synonymous with the political abolitionist side, she obviously gained a lot further popularity beyond Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Impending Crisis of the South, book about how slavery affected whites. It articulated a perspective about the effect of slavery not only on blacks but on whites, specifically in the South. This caused the Southern plantation elite to grow increasingly upset with the North and fueled their fears of poor whites to abandon their elitist causes. So it's important to know that in the South, the plantation elite were a small group of people, not even close to the majority of people actually owned slaves. It was just the institution of slavery that inspired these poor whites to eventually, get on their level. But once this book really exposed that the majority of white people in the South were actually not well off because of slavery, it really influenced many people inside the South to abandon slavery as well as the North. New England Emigrant Aid Company, anti-slavery organization funding ventures to Kansas. They funded trips of abolitionists to Kansas in order to throw the popular sovereignty vote to the abolitionist side. They helped to join the North and the West as lands of the free. Now, not only abolitionists were flooding Kansas, but anti-abolitionists from the South were also flooding into Kansas, setting up for a conflict. Beecher's Bibles, Guns for Pioneers. They were named after Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, showing how the Kansas pioneers thought of them as abolitionist tools. So this really revealed how tools of violence were the resorted to item, I guess you could say, for these abolitionists. John Brown, violent abolitionist in Kansas. He's very famous. He turned to violent attacks in order to rid Kansas of the pro-slaveryites. His actions helped to start bleeding Kansas, which spilled into the Civil War. And the eventual creating of John Brown into a martyr even further polarized the South and the North over the Kansas issue. The Compton Constitution for Kansas, which allowed for slavery. It was a sneaky tactic by the pro-slaveryites, which caused a boycott of its ratification. They really took advantage of the chaos in Kansas to try and pass some government, even though it wasn't really legitimate. This led to it becoming a national issue promoted by Democrats, where it was shot down by free soilers across the country. Ultimately, it delayed Kansas's statehood and divided the Democrats between James Douglas and more radical Southerners. Bleeding Kansas, years of violence in Kansas over slavery. It showed how the differences between abolitionists and pro-slaveryites were growing greater and turning to violence. It foreshadowed the Civil War and how it was solved by violence instead of diplomacy. One of the main narratives of the United States' approach to Civil War is really understanding how violence played a role in these debates and how we drifted slowly towards violence. Sumner Brooks clash, abolitionist Sumner versus pro-slavery Brooks. They actually started fighting on the congressional floor. Sumner and South Carolinian senators had been exchanging words until Brooks stood up for his state and in turn beat Sumner unconscious. It revealed how dangerous the opposing opinion on slavery were becoming, and politicians and people couldn't see wrong if the person agreed with their side. So even after this clash, the senators on their side did not condemn the actions because they felt that violence was something worth in the fight for slavery or against slavery. Republican Party, Northern Sectional Party, they were basically only concentrated in the North. They were passionately against slavery, and they helped to clean out the North and eventually sectionalize the North behind Republicans and South behind the Democrats. So the Republican Party really consolidated every political faction in the North, and this basically pinned the Republicans directly against the Democrats as the two main parties, which of course we still have today. Know Nothing Party, Party for Nativism. Although they were not immensely popular, they gained the dying Whig Party's supporters and shed light on a greater American nativism and racism that extended beyond slavery. So the racism in America wasn't only against black people, only against slaves, but also against other races that were not, American whites. Election of 1856, Democrat James Buchanan won the election. It showed that conservatism, regardless of slavery, was still dominant in America because James Buchanan did not take real hard stances on slavery and things like that. He was just a conservative. It delayed the battle between North and South, but it set the stage for a wild election in 1860. Looking back in history, it is pretty evident that a conservative was not needed in this time of immense debate. Something had to be solved. So James Buchanan election pretty much did nothing to stop our approach to a civil war. Dred Scott versus Sanford, ruling against Dred Scott's sue for freedom. It was an unexpected win for the South, who saw the Supreme Court rule that Congress cannot outlaw slavery in a territory, which is huge. When the North refused to go along with it, the South angered in the fact that the North refused to follow the Supreme Court's ruling, pushing them further towards secession. On the legal side of this, basically the case stated that property could not be taken away from someone. So if a Southern plantation owner were to take his slaves into the North, the government could not take their slaves, which basically legalized slavery in any part of the United States, which was obviously a crazy ruling and a huge win for the South. In this case was extremely controversial. Roger B. Taney, Supreme Court Justice, he backed the decision of the Supreme Court to move farther than just the Dred Scott case and to pursue the more aggressive action of outlawing Congress's ability to even legislate slavery in the territories. So this would basically immunize slavery, the institution of slavery, from any action by the government. Panic of 1857, economic and psychological crash. I used the wrong word. It caused both an economic crash, but a depressing outlook on life from the perspective of many poor people. It led to many poor people asking the government for land to bail them out of their hunger and misery. So here we see the beginnings of a narrative really exploded in the 20th century of the people looking to the government for handouts and bailouts. Homesteads, free land of 160 acres. Many poor people wanted the land in response to the economic crash, so when the Homestead Act was set to pass, Democratic President James Buchanan struck it down. It showed further evidence of how the planter elite was hell-bent on expanding slavery, and in turn, poor Southern whites against the rich landowners. So obviously, if this Homestead Act was passed, the planter elite would not be able to expand into all of this land because it would be given out to individual people. But as long as the land was left to be independently bought and sold, these rich plantation owners could expand and obviously expand their slavery. Tariff of 1857, lower tariff after economic crash. Although the North advocated for more federal funds, their true reason for being against the lowering of tariffs was because they wanted more economic protection. It shows how each side was using federal policy to advantage them before the Civil War. So both sides were actually preparing and kind of foreshadowing a civil war, and they were trying to get ahead before it eventually commenced. Abraham Lincoln, Illinois Republican. Yes, the Abraham Lincoln. He was a rising Republican who eventually used his background as a poor frontiersman that influenced his honesty and patience to lead America through the Civil War as a president. His role in American history is going to be shown more in the next coming chapters. Lincoln-Douglas debates for Illinois Senate. Their debates were insightful and challenged the views of Democrats and Republicans. They were influential in posing many questions that were subject to national debate and policymaking. These were very revolutionarily public debates, and the people had a lot of involvement in asking questions, kind of like the debates we see today. Freeport Doctrine, opinion that slavery trumps the Supreme Court regardless. It was a popular Douglas Democratic opinion that popular sovereignty is the answer for slavery debates, not legislation and not the courts. This opinion further split the Democratic Party, and it aided the split of politics to pure sectionalism, northern and southern, and free versus slavery lines. Harper's Ferry, Federal Arsenal in Virginia. When an abolitionist force led by John Brown raided the fort, it led to a national divided response. The North regarded Brown as a martyr, but the South argued that they could no longer exist in a union where their own countrymen were violently attacking them. The South took the innocent victim side of this, which honestly is fair in the situation, and they really tried to play up their shock about the abolitionist violence. Constitutional Union Party, moderate faction of the Democratic Party. They were based on the Constitution and the laws, which made them stay away from taking sides on controversial issues. This way they remained as moderate as possible between the growing sectional divide of the North and South. So obviously this party was trying to place themselves in the middle of the two sides. But as everyone knows, in politics, this sort of compromise and staying in the middle doesn't really work to garner votes. Election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins. Although Lincoln won, he was a clear minority president, displaying the immense divide in the country. He did not even come close to the popular vote. The Southern response was defiant, leading to South Carolina being the first of many states to secede shortly after the election. Many Southern states started seeing his election as an end to all hope of them ever having representation in the government, ever having a chance to secure slavery in the government, because they were losing power in the government. Crittenden Amendments, compromise amendments for slavery. The last-ditch effort failed as Lincoln rejected them, and all hope for compromise was lost. The rejection of the Crittenden Amendments all but made the Civil War inevitable. Confederate States of America, the new government created by secessionist states. Despite all of the chaos in the South, the secessionist states were able to form a somewhat organized government with a strong president. It put on display the South's ability to organize against the North. So the South's kind of quick ability to establish a government really showed that the Civil War would be a fight, not just a failed rebellion. Secession, act of a state leaving the Union. It was the final act of many Southern states. They left for many reasons, but the chief issue was always, of course, slavery. When the North refused to allow the Union to be dismantled, the Civil War was started. So at the outbreak of the Civil War, it was supposed to be about the dissolution versus resolution of the Union, but was really central to the debate was obviously slavery, even though a lot of these secessionist documents published by the states that, of course, seceded tried to talk about different things, but it was obviously slavery. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.